Did aliens build the pyramids like in Stargate? Or as that crazy hair TV guy says? Well, if you said no, then you probably also know Stone Age humans didn't build them either. But the movie 10,000 BC tries to make you believe otherwise. Even movies that claim to show us real history lean more towards entertainment over facts. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are the 25 most historically inaccurate movies ever. Let's start at the very beginning of humanity and storytelling as we know it. Or at least where Hollywood thinks storytelling began, 10,000 BC. This movie invites us to dream of a Stone Age world filled with mammoth-powered construction projects, domesticated saber-toothed cats, and pyramid building thousands of years before the actual Egyptians began work on construction. In reality, this is the equivalent of dinosaurs sharing a scene with astronauts. There were no massive civilizations that we know of in 10,000 BCE. Only small hunter-gatherer bands, and the earliest signs of agriculture were in Mesopotamia. Pyramid construction? Yeah, that came much later, around 2600 BCE, in Egypt. This film treats ancient history like a buffet, grabbing whatever looks tasty and putting it all on the same plate. By turning the beginning of civilization into a fantasy quest, the film promotes a bizarre understanding of prehistoric life. These myths add to the public confusion about when major human achievements happened, leaving anyone looking for a clear window into the past with, well, more questions than answers. Which leads me to the next film on our list, which tries to take on one of the oldest stories ever recorded, 7,000 years later. Loosely based on Homer's epic The Iliad, Troy brings the legendary Trojan War to life, but brings its decade-long timeline to the span of about 2 weeks. The film combines characters, rearranges their fates, and leaves out the role of the gods entirely, which were pretty central to the original myth. Paris and Helen's relationship is romanticized, and Achilles is a more brooding action hero than the mythic warrior. Historically, Troy likely existed, and there may have been a war over trade routes rather than a romance. Also, Achilles never met Briseis the way the film suggests, and Hector's funeral happens way too quickly. And the wooden horse? That was a good strategy for mythology, but well, it lacks evidence in reality. Films like this rewrite legendary stories as historical fact, further warping our view of ancient civilizations. They erase the line between mythology and archaeology, creating confusion about what's real and what's just a poetic metaphor. Let's head another 2,000 years into the future for our next historically dubious film. This is Sparta! And this is mostly fiction. 300 takes the Battle of Thermopylae and displays it through a comic book lens. Shirtless Spartans fighting an endless stream of mutant-like Persians while King Xerxes struts around like a blinged-out fashion model. It's stylish, sure, but accurate? No, not really. True Spartans wore armor and helmets. As for the Persian army, they were a multicultural force, not a horde of monsters. Xerxes wasn't 9 feet tall and didn't ride on a golden platform like he was in a music video. The battle itself was heroic, just not the exaggerated last stand the film portrays. The film glorifies militarism and demonizes the other. It reinforces obsolete East versus West narratives and oversimplifies complex geopolitical conflicts into dualistic duels between nations. Ben-Hur gave us one of the most iconic chariot races in film history. And with that, also a laundry list of historical inaccuracies. From anachronistic chronological detection devices like wristwatches visible in Roman crowds, to exaggerations taken with Jewish and Roman customs, this movie exercises quite a bit of creative license with the first century. The backdrop of Christ's crucifixion is used as a spiritual anchor for the protagonist's journey, but that's more biblical fiction than historical integration. Romans didn't attend crucifixions casually like theater performance, and most Jews didn't randomly challenge empire officials. And no, nobody drove a chariot that fast on sand. There's also that part where Pontius Pilate wears a purple toga at the chariot race. Well, purple togas were only allowed for the emperor and the consuls. And in the boat scene, Roman warship rowers were not slaves, but paid workers in the ship's crew. The film contributed to the American myth of early Christianity as a cinematic narrative of personal redemption, rather than a complex socio-political movement. The result? A golden age classic that blurs religion, history, and heroism. And the next film on our list was inspired by this formula. Making movies, singing songs, and fighting around the world. If this next movie also fails to teach you something about the Roman Empire, perhaps you can simply enjoy it? You are enjoying this video, right? Are you not entertained? Russell Crowe yells, stabs, and scowls his way through Gladiator, but the story he's telling isn't based on any real Roman general. Maximus is fictional, and his rivalry with Emperor Commodus is embellished for dramatic effect. In real life, Commodus was assassinated in a bath, not stabbed in the Colosseum before a cheering crowd. The film paints Commodus as a megalomaniacal psychopath, when in reality he was more inept than evil. The Senate wasn't some noble democracy trying to survive. It was a self-serving aristocracy that got along just fine with emperors when it benefited them. Gladiatorial combat was merely brutal entertainment, not the breeding ground for a political revolution. Gladiator reshapes Rome into a morality tale about honor versus tyranny. That may make for good drama, but it also distorts how power and politics actually worked in one of history's most complex empires. And when it comes to empires, they're usually destroyed from within before they're ever destroyed from without. Where have I heard that one before? Let's head 500 years in the future and to the other side of the planet for our next film. Braveheart might be the most patriotic film ever made about a guy who wore a kilt before kilts existed. Mel Gibson's take on William Wallace is stirring stuff. Freedom, betrayal, face paint. But it's more fan fiction than fact. For starters, 13th century Scots didn't wear kilts, and Wallace was actually a minor nobleman, not some rugged Highland outlaw. The film compresses decades of conflict into a couple of bloody years and gives Wallace credit for rebellions that happened long after his death. Oh, and that steamy affair with the French princess? Total fantasy. She was about 9 when Wallace died. Yikes. The face paint. Yes, it looks good in the film, but it's not accurate in any way. The idea comes from blue paint or swirling tattoos that some tribes living in Scotland wore into battle against the Romans. This was what earned themselves the Roman name Picti, or painted people. Braveheart is around 1,000 years too late for that, and the sword was a bit too long to be practical. By rewriting Wallace's story as a one-man quest for liberty, the film creates a mythology that overshadows the real collective struggle for Scottish independence. The movie's battle scenes are epic without a doubt. It's historical freedom. The movie's battle scenes are epic without a doubt. It's historical freedom! Gives viewers a wildly inaccurate picture of medieval politics and warfare. And if you don't mind staying with me on the topic of Mel Gibson's wild historical inaccuracies and chronological catastrophes, let's just take a look at Mel Gibson's Apocalypto is a gritty, high-energy chase film set in the waning days of the Maya civilization, but historically, it's more like a jungle-themed fever dream. The movie portrays the Maya as violent savages obsessed with human sacrifice. Yet that image conflates them with the later Aztecs and ignores the complex urban nature of Maya society. The Maya built libraries and observatories, not just death pits and temples. To make things worse, the timeline is skewed. The arrival of the Spanish conquistadors at the film's end is way off. By the time they arrived, the Maya had already gone through societal collapse centuries earlier. And human sacrifice, while part of some Maya rituals, was nowhere near the industrial-scale horror factory the movie depicts. Gibson basically traded anthropology for adrenaline. By depicting early Western civilizations as brutal and doomed, the film reinforces old colonial myths that indigenous people needed saving. These portrayals distort our understanding of native cultures and perpetuate stereotypes that still influence real-world attitudes today. Critics suggest that focusing heavily on these aspects reinforces existing stereotypes about indigenous peoples as being savage or overly brutal, while overlooking the complexity and achievements of their civilization. But you know what? Colonialism just seems to be one of those periods that Hollywood just can't help itself from routinely reinventing, even in kids' movies. The Road to El Dorado is a fun, vibrant buddy comedy about 2 Spanish conmen who stumble into the mythical city of gold. While the movie gets credit for its catchy music and sharp banter, its historical sense is, well, let's just say it's more fantasy than fact. This movie was like, facts or fiction? Both. Both is good. The story plays fast and loose with Mesoamerican culture, geography, and colonial history, basically mixing the Aztec, Maya, and Inca motifs into a muddled fictional stew. In reality, there was no single city of El Dorado located in Central America. It was a European myth tied to South America and the legend of a golden king. The movie features pyramids that look Mayan, human sacrifices that recall Aztec rituals, and vague tropical jungles with a bit of everything thrown in. The people of El Dorado speak perfect English, wear a bizarre mix of cultural dress, and welcome two Europeans with very little suspicion, despite, the whole colonial genocide thing. While it's a kid's film and not pretending to be a documentary, The Road to El Dorado contributes to the ongoing Hollywood habit of homogenizing indigenous cultures into a colorful backdrop. It perpetuates the idea that all ancient Mesoamerican civilizations were the same and treats colonialism as a punchline. It's entertaining, sure, but it's a reminder that even animated films can quietly warp how young viewers understand history. Speaking of colonizers, Cate Blanchett dazzles in Elizabeth, but don't mistake the shine for accuracy. The film turns Queen Elizabeth I's early reign into a suspense thriller where she constantly is dodging assassins and romantic betrayal. The problem? Most of these threats were exaggerated or non-existent during her first years on the throne. The movie combines timelines and characters, shrinking years of political tension into a single overdramatic arc. For example, the Duke of Anjou wasn't some suitor she dramatically rejected. He was a serious diplomatic option. And Elizabeth's transformation into the Virgin Queen, that was a calculated move, not a sudden epiphany in a white dress. By dramatizing Elizabeth's rise as a series of emotional decisions rather than shrewd political strategy, the film undercuts the intelligence and tactics that made her a famous ruler. It's not just about getting details wrong, it's about shifting the story from agency to accident. Colors of the Wind may be catchy, but history sings a different tune, and it's painting this movie with all the colors of BS. Disney's Pocahontas transforms a tale of colonization into a multicultural romance. In reality, Pocahontas was about 10 or 11 when she met John Smith. So yeah, that relationship is not just historically accurate, it's unsettling. The movie also erases the brutal realities of English settlement, including the violence, disease, and forced displacement inflicted upon indigenous peoples. And John Smith's accounts of being saved by Pocahontas, they're dubious at best, probably invented to boost his own fame. By turning a story of colonization into a love story, the film spreads a sanitized version of history that glosses over indigenous suffering. That's not just misleading, it's damaging to how people understand colonialism and its long-term consequences. Mel Gibson strikes again with The Patriot, a Revolutionary War drama that trades fact for firepower. The film mashes together various real-life figures into one composite hero and invents atrocities like the church burning scene, which has no historical basis and was widely condemned by historians. British officers are painted as cartoonish villains, gleefully executing civilians, while the Americans are righteous defenders of liberty, conveniently ignoring that, slavery was alive and well on both sides. Speaking of which, the film goes out of its way to portray the main character's slaves as free workers, which is both inaccurate and a pretty shady retcon. The Patriot promotes a romanticized version of the American Revolution, reinforcing national myths while avoiding messy truths. That shapes how generations think about freedom, race, and warfare. Ridley Scott's Napoleon gives us a moody emperor, a stormy love affair, and battles with more smoke than sense. But history buffs were quick to notice glaring problems. From Napoleon watching Marie Antoinette's execution, he wasn't there, to cannonballs knocking down entire pyramids, which absolutely didn't happen. The film jumps through time like a skipping record, glossing over Napoleon's early military career and his key reforms in favor of over-dramatized court scenes and gratuitous battlefield carnage. It's like they took a fascinating life and said, what if we just focus on his mood swings? This kind of storytelling turns historical giants into emotional caricatures. It narrows our understanding of leaders to their worst impulses, stripping away the nuance and context that define their legacies. Steven Spielberg's Amistad shines a much-needed light on the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, but it still falls into some familiar traps. While the story of the ship revolt and the resulting court case is true, the film focuses heavily on white saviors, particularly John Quincy Adams, at the expense of the enslaved Africans' own voices. Much of the legal drama is accurate, but the film's emotional core relies on fictionalized speeches and inflated American moral heroism. The Africans themselves are mostly passive or angry, with only one or two given real depth or agency. This framing centers the American justice system as ultimately fair and redemptive, which oversimplifies a long and brutal legacy of slavery and systemic racism. It turns a rare moment of justice into a stand-in for broader redemption. D.W. Griffith's 1915 film The Birth of a Nation is often cited as a cinematic landmark, but it's also a landmark of racism and historical distortion. It portrays the Reconstruction era as a time of chaos brought on by African Americans and glorifies the Ku Klux Klan as heroic defenders of the Southern virtue. That's not just inaccurate, it is dangerous. The film's depiction of black legislators as buffoons and sexual offenders wasn't just wrong, it directly contradicted the efforts of newly enfranchised African Americans who served in government with dignity and determination. And the heroic Klan? In real life, they were a violent terrorist group, not noble vigilantes in white hoods. This film didn't just twist history, it helped rewrite it in the public mind. It contributed to a wave of white supremacy, inspired the KKK's resurgence, and influenced racial attitudes for decades. Its legacy is a case study on how media can warp collective memory. Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves aimed to be more respectful of Native Americans than earlier westerns, and in some ways it succeeded. But that doesn't mean it's accurate. The film centers a white protagonist's journey into the Lakota culture, where he quickly becomes more noble and brave than the people he's supposed to be learning from. The Lakota characters are mostly passive, or wise guides, existing to help John Dunbar find himself. While the language and costuming are more authentic than usual, the plot is still rooted in the outdated white savior narrative, where the outsider is the most exceptional figure in a community he barely understands. The film's good intentions don't cancel out its structural problems. By making native life the backdrop for one man's redemption, it flattens history and robs indigenous people of complexity and agency. James Cameron's Titanic is a love story so gripping that it sank historical accuracy as fast as the ship. Yes, the broad strokes of the disaster are true. The iceberg, the class divisions, the lack of lifeboats. But the film fills in the gaps with a fictionalized romance that overshadows the real tragedy. Characters like Rose and Jack never existed. And while some real people, like Captain Smith and Molly Brown, are featured, their personalities are often wildly exaggerated. And no, there is no record of a romantic artist stowing away on board and teaching society girls how to spit off the side of a ship. By focusing on doomed romance rather than systemic failures like corporate greed and classism, the film turns a complex tragedy into a dramatic fable. It's emotionally satisfying, sure, but it encourages viewers to see Titanic sinking as a personal heartbreak instead of a preventable disaster. Colin Firth's performance as King George VI won an Oscar, but the King's Speech trims and smooths royal history to fit a neat emotional arc. The film dramatizes the king's struggle with a speech impediment and his relationship with speech therapist Lionel Logue. The problem? What makes Logue seem like a magical outsider who saved the monarchy, when in reality their relationship was longer, more professional, and less dramatic. The timeline compresses events like the abdication of Edward VIII and reassigns dialogue and motivations to fit its structure. Churchill's role is also reimagined, making him more involved in the king's personal journey than he actually was. By turning the story into an underdog triumph, the film sidelines the political complexities of the era, especially the monarchy's reluctance to confront rising fascism in Europe. It's history as a therapy session. I miss you more than Michael Bay missed the mark when he made Pearl Harbor. And that's proof that explosions don't equal accuracy. While the attack on Pearl Harbor did happen, shocker, the film adds a melodramatic love triangle and numerous fictional subplots, including a fighter pilot somehow managing to join the Doolittle raid mere days after the bombing. Historical figures like Admiral Yamamoto are flattened into cliches, and the film glosses over critical details, such as the intelligence failures and the bureaucratic missteps that made the attack so devastating. Even the iconic dogfight scenes are jacked up with implausible maneuvers that defy the laws of physics. By turning Pearl Harbor into an action romance blockbuster, the film trivializes a pivotal moment in American history. It turns systemic failure into a backdrop for personal drama, which shifts public focus away from the real lessons of that day. Why does Michael Bay get to keep on making movies? I guess Pearl Harbor sucked just a little bit more than I Miss You. Benedict Cumberbatch's Alan Turing is brilliant, tragic, and a bit of a jerk, which is one of the few accurate things in the Imitation Game. While the film rightfully spotlights Turing's contributions to breaking the Nazi Enigma code, it mangles nearly everything else. The team effort at Bletchley Park is reduced to a one-man genius show, and key colleagues are almost entirely erased. The film invents unnecessary drama, like Turing being investigated for treason, and downplays the systemic cruelty of his post-war prosecution for homosexuality. While it helped introduce Turing to a wider audience, the movie also reinforces the lone wolf genius myth, and glosses over the institutional collaboration that actually won the code-breaking war. Madonna as Eva Peron? Yeah, sure, why not? Evita is a musical retelling of the life of Argentina's most controversial first lady, and while it hits a few historical beats, it spins the narrative through a Broadway blender. Eva is portrayed as both saintly and tragic, with less focus on her political manipulation or the darker side of Peronism. The film downplays her authoritarian tendencies and romanticizes her relationship with the Argentinian people. Meanwhile, Juan Perón is made to seem like a benign bystander, when in fact, he was consolidating power through populist nationalism and political repression. Musicals tend to flatten nuance in favor of emotional highs, but Evita helped export a sanitized heroic version of a woman whose real-life legacy is far more complicated. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer is a cinematic tour de force, but even atomic bombs don't vaporize all historical inaccuracies. While the film captures J. Robert Oppenheimer's scientific brilliance and moral torment with intensity, it cuts corners on key moments and omits important context, especially about the people affected by the bomb. Native communities downwind of the Trinity test? Not a whisper. The Japanese victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Entirely unseen. Nolan gets creative with timelines and character dynamics. The relationship between Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock is dramatized well beyond history. Some dialogues, while powerful, are more philosophical poetry than documentary realism. Also, Lewis Strauss was certainly political, but the film turns him into a Bond villain, which is, let's say, a slight overreach. The film invites viewers to face the burden of scientific discovery, but by omitting Japanese victims and collapsing timelines, it risks turning a real-world tragedy into a morality play. It's brilliant, yes, but when nuclear history becomes a metaphor, we risk forgetting its deeply human cost. The Help serves up a story about race relations in the Jim Crow South, with a heavy helping of white savior narrative. Centered around Skeeter, the white aspiring journalist, and the black maid she interviews, the film simplifies systemic racism into personal cruelty and redemption, and then loops it into a spicy tell-all book. It's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Real-life domestic workers in the 60s faced economic exploitation, sexual violence, and dangerous working conditions, but the movie packages these truths in an Oprah-approved drama. Characters like Minnie and Abilene are rich and emotional, but still positioned as sidekicks in Skeeter's arc. And yes, the terrible, awful pie scene is iconic, but it also undercuts the seriousness of what these women endured. By putting a neat little bow on racial reconciliation, The Help offers catharsis without justice. It smooths over black resistance and white complicity, molding how many viewers think racism works, as a personal flaw rather than a system. John Waters' Hairspray, and its musical adaptations, spins a tale of dance floor integration in 1960s Baltimore, set to catchy tunes and colorful wigs. It's lively, funny, and progressive for its time, but it also makes civil rights look like a talent show with a happy ending. desegregation wasn't just dancing to the right beat. While the story is loosely based on events surrounding the Buddy Dean show, the real push for integration was far messier and more dangerous than televised protests and locker room makeovers. The black characters, while powerful in spirit, still exist mostly to support the journey of the white heroine, Tracy Turnblad. Hairspray suggests that change comes easily when people dance together, but the real story of desegregation was one of lawsuits, arrests, and often violent resistance. When you turn struggle into showbiz, you can inspire audiences, but also risk treating activism as entertainment. Kathryn Bigelow's The Hurt Locker brought home the Oscar for Best Picture and delivered one of the tensest depictions of modern warfare ever filmed. But ask any real bomb disposal technician, and they'll likely tell you it's more Hollywood thriller than military realism. The film follows a reckless lone wolf EOD tech who disarms bombs with a swagger more fit for an action movie than an army base. In real life, bomb techs are methodical professionals who work in tightly coordinated teams. Running solo into the danger zone, yanking wires, and tossing off the protective suit mid-mission? That's less standard procedure and more Darwin Awards nominee. The adrenaline is real, but so are the consequences the film ignores in favor of drama. Emphasizing personal bravado over unit cohesion and training, this movie glamorizes chaos and treats war as a psychological showdown between soldier and circumstance. It disregards the professionalism of real service members and paints war less as a geopolitical tragedy and more as a backdrop for personal thrill-seeking. Aaron Sorkin's The Social Network gave us Jesse Eisenberg as a hoodie-wearing, emotionally stunted Mark Zuckerberg. While it's undeniably entertaining, it's also more Silicon Valley Shakespeare than a true origin story of Facebook. The film turns a slow-moving tech startup saga into a betrayal-laced drama where every glance means something and every lawsuit has a monologue. The real Zuckerberg insists that most of the movie is fiction, especially the portrayal of his motivations. He wasn't trying to impress a girl or win back a lost love. He was coding obsessively and thinking about networks, not heartbreak. Meanwhile, other real-life figures like Eduardo Saverin and the Winklevoss twins are flattened into archetypes: the betrayed friend and the privileged rivals. By dramatizing the creation of Facebook as a personal revenge tale, The Social Network reinforces the myth of the lone genius, a brilliant, emotionally tortured man who reshapes the world out of bitterness. It's compelling storytelling, but it obscures the actual forces, investment capital, privilege, and timing that drive tech empires. So, which movie inspired you to relearn everything you think you know? As the saying goes, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. So make sure your learning is on point, or you might find yourself having to rewind. And once you're caught up, be sure to check out this list here, and as always, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, check out social medias, do all that fun stuff. Really helps the channel. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next time.